great pleasure to be here, and in particular to deal with the topic of how people from different disciplines can work together on important goals that relate to child health. And I would say it's not so much how they can work together, but how they must, how they should work together. And what I'd like to do is to talk about one area that to some extent extends the wonderful talk of Maureen Durkin, and that's the area of the relationship of war and violence on the development of children. And the points I wish to make are, one, that there are enormous numbers of children in the world today that are growing up under conditions of violence and conflict. Two, that growing up under such circumstances have detrimental effects on the optimal growth and development of these children. Three, that many of these children have been forgotten by us. And four, that there indeed are approaches that are both important and effective to help these children as they hopefully grow into adulthood and then can improve their lives and the places that they're living in. That this type of intervention requires the collaboration and efforts of people from very, very different disciplines, and that the improvement of the lives of children cannot simply be left to biologically oriented interventions. You can go to sleep. That's basically what I want to say. Now, I'm starting out with this. I start out most of my talks with this to point out this is a wonderful prose description. It's called The Lamentations on the Destruction of the City of Ur. City of Ur was in a great empire and is located in a place which is now called Iraq. And this prose, it's actually a poem in a way, was written around 4,000 years ago. It's probably one of the earliest long-sustained pieces of prose that we have access to. And it speaks very poignantly not only of the terrible things that happened in the city of Ur, but of the role and suffering of children within that time and place. And the reason I always show it is to point out that as long as we have a history of humankind, there have been terrible things that have happened, and children have grown up in very difficult circumstances. Just to take off on what Maureen showed, this is a very interesting map which shows by area, size, where the children of the world are. And where are they? They're in Asia, they're in Africa, they're in the subcontinent continent of Asia. This is a graph that shows mortality of 1 to 4-year-olds, and it shows the degree to which the excess mortality of 1 to 4-year-olds is not in North America, but is elsewhere. So if we're really concerned about this millennial goal and the implications of children who live and the quality of their lives, we really need to look at specific parts of the world where children are. And in fact, if we look at where the recent wars have been since 1975, we could overlay that map on the previous map that I've shown. This is simply an example of where landmine casualties are. And again, we could overlay those maps. Now, the picture of war is Rambo, Clint Eastwood, Steve McQueen. But really, the picture of war are these children and this young fellow. I just want to take one example in terms of numbers. The Second Congo War, which is a huge war that's been going on since 1998. About 50% of the deaths have been in children. There have been over 5 million deaths. And collateral damage, the ripple effect, is only increasing. How many times have people here read about this in the State Journal? I would suggest maybe never. 5 million children in the world are stateless. What does it mean to be stateless? It means to have no access to health care, to all the things that we associated with our quote-unquote rights. Who are the forgotten children? These are only some of them. In the refugee camps around the world, where there are about 32 million people, about half are children. Most are women and children. We've heard about the lost boys of Sudan, very poignant stories which we need to pay attention to. But what about the lost girls? Are there no girls from Sudan? They've been hidden. Many of them have had to live, if they've lived, under extremely difficult circumstances. Boy soldiers are another, and we'll get back to this, widespread phenomenon of the wars I'm talking about. But there are girls involved too, and the suffering is compounded by the fact that even in all the literature that many of you have read, they are forgotten. There are enormous numbers of orphans. The way you grow up to be a human being is for somebody to fall in love with you and somebody to care for you. These orphans, many of them are out to sea on that. There are 86 million in India alone, 44 million in Africa. In Eritrea, there have been so many deaths as a result of the recent, and maybe not so recent, wars with Ethiopia, that in the usual cultural circumstances where orphans are taken in to families, there are no families left. And there have had to be orphanages built. So we're recreating this problem. Street children, which is a pejorative term in many areas of the world. In India, there are 11 million alone. There are many, many hundreds of thousands in countries around of the world, South America, Africa, elsewhere. All of these groups have something in common, among other things. They are heavily exposed to violence, both as victims and witnesses. This is something that is not alien to our own society. In a paper some years ago, I and my colleagues have shown that children in foster care are exposed to enormous amounts of violence. So children's exposure to violence in this Venn diagram include community violence, domestic violence, which is a very great problem all over the world and in our society as well, child abuse, and war. And I will concentrate more on war. These are all very important topics, but I will, in 18 minutes, focus on one aspect. Now, the UN, since we're dealing with millennial goals, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was a very important document which was voted in 1989. Two nations, and have very important guidelines that deal with such things as I have already mentioned. There are 2 countries of the UN who have not ratified it. Somalia, because they have no government, and the United States. because of the government we've had. Conflict, as Professor Durkin has shown, conflict goes along with poverty. About 90% of all the conflicts occur in rather poorly resourced countries. And of the 20 poorest countries in the world, 16 have been involved in wars over the last 20 years. Maternal child health in the 10 poorest countries at war in 2000, I have the list here. It basically, maternal child health scores poorly in those countries who are poorest and at war. The worldwide arms trading, which sustains these wars, you don't have to go through all the numbers, but note that the USA, UK, France, Russia, and China are among the top 6. Those 5 are the permanent members of the UN Security Council, which is supposed to be our international body that controls war. First point, why am I showing these slides? I want to point out that there are biological interventions that are enormously important for these children and populations that are affected. But there are larger issues of a sociological and political nature that we turn away from at our peril, and certainly the peril of the people involved. 1/3 of poorly resourced countries spend more on arms than on education, and most spend more on arms than education and health put together. Now, my own work has been to look at what are the perceptions of children about their lives who are growing up under these difficult conditions, and how can we use the voices of children and what they tell us to develop interventions that can help them. And I'll speak about a little bit of some of the things that I've been doing, but once again I want to point out that in order to both examine the question as a research topic and to develop an intervention, it has required working with people who have expertise in a wide variety of areas. And it could only be done under such a fashion. One thing that we did was to develop ways of speaking to children and developing information from children who come from a wide variety of cultures and speak very different languages. And so I'm just going to go through this quickly. We developed cartoon ways of examining children. What I showed you very quickly is we introduce a cartoon of someone. It's drawn to be culturally relevant, and we show this is a boy or girl just like you, and talk about some of the things that they've seen. A couple of points. One, that being a witness as well as a victim affects children and their psychological well-being. That the exposure to the difficulties of conflict and war zones, whether it's in a refugee camp or in a zone of conflict like Gaza, has implications for the mental well-being of children. I did want to point out that it has implications for kids here as well, that the exposure to violence, especially domestic violence, community violence, has implications for children's performance in school. And there are complex reasons for that, but it's not irrelevant. In a place like Chechnya, the problems are huge. You see very large percentages. I'm going through this quickly, I know, because I want to get to speak about a particular type of intervention. One of the things that we were very interested in is, as we look at children over time in development, what are their ideas about people like themselves or not like themselves. And we use cartoons to do that. This is one example. This was used in the Middle East. We have a girl that's on a swing. A new girl comes, and we can label that new girl as either being part of the in-group or an out-group, and see what children think about inviting this new girl to play with them, or what they think of her. One of the long-term effects of growing up in zones of violent conflict is an intensification of in-group identification and an intensification of negative stereotypes of people who are not like you. This is seen in children as young as 4. And the reason we don't see it younger, of course, is that it's very difficult to get information from them. There's, in general, a diminution of a commitment to distributive justice and democratic values. So what this means is there can be very long-term ripple effects for an entire society of things that happen when children are young. We actually, this is from a study we did in the Middle East. We contracted with a Lebanese, Beirut survey organization, and we were able to find, just as has been found in other places, that 80% of households, even in very impoverished areas, even in refugee camps, they watch television and they have access to television. And so for this reason, we developed an intervention that was based, this was with International Sesame Workshop, that was based on television. And I just want to show you a few clips. Jake, can you help me? Well, while he's doing that, let me just tell you what you're going to see and why. What we wanted to do is to use stories that were developed from the people's own specific culture. Every culture has positive moral stories about being good, about sharing, but mostly with people like you. And what we wanted to do was to help children see that people not like them, short, fat, tall, short, darker, lighter, are just like you. This is what people thought was important. I'm just going to show very short. Okay, so this is showing similarities and differences. Basically, what we found was that first of all, that an enormously high percentage of people watched these things in all the cultures, even though we were attacked in local newspapers as American imperialists who were injuring the brains of young children. The Minister of Education in several of these countries were I'm being televised. Anyway, it was enormously positive, and what we found was that over a period of an exposure of just a matter of weeks, we could find changes in attitudes of young children, and we did follow-ups that showed that it, at least over a period of some months, lasted. We also did interviews in schools and where the pro-social behavior of young children who had, because in fact, the things we were trying to show weren't only being nice to people not like you, but to be nice to people like you as well. And my point then is, this just shows you some of the differences that we were able to show. My point then is that television and the media can be used in an important way. Even if the differences are small, the populations that you can possibly get to are very large. And it would have been impossible to do this project without the input of people who understood focus groups, polling, particularly telephone polling, and the social science of developing media intervention. So my point is that the social media as well as television and film can be very powerful modes of intervention. But it is only if we cross the street with some people with other expertise that we can possibly affect this. Thank you.